Silent Depths by Erwin Montrose. HMS Deterrence Prologue. The Silent Shield, the United Kingdom's nuclear deterrent. Beneath the rolling waves of the North Atlantic, deep below the surface where light cannot reach, a silent force patrols the vast uncharted expanse. Few know their names, fewer still their mission, yet they are the last line of defence, an unyielding pillar of British national security. This is Operation Relentless, the United Kingdom's continuous at-sea deterrence, CASD, an ever-present, unseen guardian of the realm, where at least one Vanguard-class submarine is always deployed, carrying the most devastating weaponry mankind has ever created. This is the story of HMS Deterrence and the existential burden carried by the men and women entrusted with Britain's nuclear future. The origins of the deterrent. In the wake of the Second World War, as Europe lay in ruins and the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, Britain faced an existential crisis. Despite being a victor, the war had crippled its economy, and the dawn of the Cold War ushered in a new kind of fear: nuclear annihilation. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 had demonstrated the terrifying new reality of warfare. It was clear that nuclear weapons weren't just a possibility, they were the future. The Soviet Union successfully tested its first nuclear bomb in 1949, ending America's nuclear monopoly and accelerating the global arms race. For Britain, it became evident that if the nation wished to retain its place on the world stage, it needed a nuclear capability of its own. Thus began the British nuclear program, culminating in the successful detonation of Operation Hurricane, Britain's first atomic bomb, on the 3rd of October 1952. The United Kingdom had officially become the world's third nuclear power, but there remained a crucial question: how should these weapons be deployed? In the early days, nuclear warheads were mounted onto V-bombers, including the famous Avro Vulcan, Handley Page Victor, and Vickers Valiant. However, as missile technology rapidly evolved, it became clear that air-based deterrents were vulnerable. Bombers could be tracked, intercepted, and destroyed before they reached their targets. A more permanent, survivable solution was needed, one that could guarantee a retaliatory strike, no matter what happened on land. Thus, the concept of continuous at-sea deterrence, CSD, was born. Why submarines? The logic behind a sea-based nuclear deterrent is simple but effective. Survivability. Unlike land-based missile silos or Air Force bombers, submarines can remain undetected, hidden deep beneath the ocean, making them nearly impossible to target in a first strike. Continuous readiness. At least one British nuclear submarine is always on patrol, ensuring that even in a worst-case scenario, a decapitation strike against Britain's leadership, retaliation would still be possible. Second strike capability. The certainty that Britain can respond with nuclear force deters enemies from launching a first strike in the first place. The very existence of the deterrent makes nuclear war less likely. The Royal Navy took this responsibility seriously. By the late 1960s, Britain had moved away from bombers and land-based missiles, committing fully to a submarine-based deterrent. The Resolution-class submarines, armed with Polaris nuclear missiles, became the first vessels to carry out continuous at-sea deterrence in 1968. Since then, British nuclear deterrence has never wavered. Not for a single day. The Vanguard class and the Trident system. By the 1980s, Polaris was becoming outdated. The government authorized a new program, Trident, a cutting-edge submarine-launched ballistic missile system developed by the United States, but carried exclusively on British submarines. This led to the creation of the Vanguard-class submarines, HMS Vanguard, Victorious, Vigilant, and Vengeance, each designed to carry up to 16 Trident II D5 ballistic missiles, each missile capable of delivering multiple nuclear warheads. With a range of over 7,400 kilometers, 4,600 miles, Trident missiles can be launched from anywhere in the ocean, hitting targets with pinpoint accuracy. The Vanguard-class submarines are built for stealth, endurance, and deadly precision, ensuring that Britain's nuclear arsenal is always out of reach, but never out of action. And so, for over 50 years, the silent patrols continued, unseen, unheard, but never absent. HMS Deterrence, the next generation. As global threats evolve, so too must Britain's deterrent. The Vanguard-class submarines are reaching the end of their operational life, and plans for their successors, the Dreadnought-class submarines, are already underway. But before the transition is complete, one final experimental vessel has been introduced into the fleet. HMS Deterrence. An advanced, highly classified testbed for the underwater Dragonfire laser system and new stealth surveillance technology, HMS Deterrence represents the cutting edge of the Royal Navy's nuclear capabilities. Designed for unprecedented deep-sea endurance and covert operations, its mission is to test systems that will eventually be incorporated into the next generation of nuclear deterrent submarines. Its deployment into the Arctic was meant to be routine, a controlled test of the laser system, a data-gathering exercise. Then it vanished. At 0342 GMT, NATO Command received the final chilling distress call from HMS Deterrence. Compromised. They took us. Not just us. The mission to retrieve it would become one of the most harrowing encounters in Royal Navy history, and what the retrieval team would discover would change the nature of warfare forever. HMS Deterrence, Chapter 1, The Silence. The distress call came at 3:42 GMT. A garbled transmission, broken by static, crackled through the NATO secure channel. Deep within the Royal Navy's Joint Operations Room in Northwood, Commander Olivia Reeves sat bolt upright as the chilling fragments of speech cut through the quiet hum of the control center.
HMS Deterrence compromised. They took us, not just us.
The signal dissolved into an eerie whine before the line went dead. Reeves, a seasoned intelligence officer with 20 years of service, exchanged glances with Lieutenant Jacob Fowler, who was monitoring submarine movements. He tapped frantically at his console, shaking his head.
Ma'am, we lost contact. No further transmissions. No response on any frequency.
What was Deterrence's last known position?
Sector 9, under the Arctic ice. Fowler's final log transmission was routine. Nothing.
Silence stretched across the room. Deterrence was a Vanguard-class nuclear submarine, part of Britain's continuous at-sea deterrence force. It was supposed to be undetectable, the very definition of stealth. Losing contact meant something had gone catastrophically wrong.
Send an immediate dispatch to HMS Vigilant. Order them to locate Deterrence and prepare a special boat service retrieval team. I want answers, and I want them fast.
Fowler nodded, issuing the orders while the room erupted into controlled chaos. Within minutes, the retrieval operation was in motion. But beneath the urgency, an unspoken tension simmered. No nuclear submarine just vanished, and yet HMS Deterrence had done just that. 0347 GMT, HMS Vigilant, Arctic Ocean. The icy expanse of the Arctic stretched endlessly in all directions. Deep below the frozen surface, HMS Vigilant, a Resolution-class submarine, cut silently through the abyssal depths. Lieutenant Commander Nathan Carter stood in the control room, arms crossed, watching the sonar technician adjust the scan parameters. Every man in the room was on edge. A missing sub meant one of two things: a catastrophic failure, or something much worse.
We've got something, the sonar operator finally muttered.
Location?
Roughly 10 nautical miles east of their last recorded position. It's adrift. No propulsion, no steering corrections, just floating.
Carter's stomach tightened.
Are we getting any response?
Negative, sir. No transmissions, but we're picking up a distress beacon.
From where?
Inside the torpedo room.
Sir, request permission to board.
Stokes regarded him for a long moment before nodding.
Take your team in. Find out what the hell happened.
Carter exhaled sharply and left the control room, already assembling his 5-man Special Boat Service, SBS, boarding team. They'd trained for this. Submarine extractions, hostage scenarios, deep-sea retrievals. But none of them had ever trained for a scenario where a nuclear submarine simply drifted, lifeless, silent, and waiting. And none of them could shake the feeling that whatever had happened on HMS Deterrence, it wasn't over yet. 0358 GMT, approaching HMS Deterrence. In the near-total darkness of the ocean, HMS Deterrence loomed like a ghost, its black hull barely distinguishable from the abyss. The boarding team moved swiftly, their mini-sub docking with the vessel's airlock. Carter went first, the airlock hissing open. He stepped inside, weapon raised. His torch beam sliced through the eerie stillness, illuminating the narrow corridor beyond. The air was stale, thick, wrong.
I don't like this, boss.
Neither do I.
The corridors were empty, no sign of struggle, no bodies, just abandoned stations. Then the lights flickered, and a sound echoed from deep within the sub, a low, distorted hum, like something half heard in a nightmare. And for the first time in his career, Nathan Carter felt something he wasn't used to feeling. Fear. Chapter 2, The Ghost Ship. The narrow corridor stretched before them, a tunnel of oppressive darkness punctuated by flickering emergency lights. Carter gestured for his men to fan out, weapons raised, as they advanced deeper into the belly of HMS Deterrence. The silence was wrong. Submarines weren't quiet places. Even in low-power mode, there should have been the hum of circulation fans, the occasional creak of metal adjusting to pressure. But here? Nothing.
No bodies, no signs of struggle. It's like they just vanished.
Keep it tight. We don't split up.
They reached the control room. Carter stepped inside, his torch sweeping over the empty seats and unoccupied consoles. A soft flicker caught his eye. The navigation panel was still active, its screen displaying a frozen command. Automated message, submarine in drift mode, primary crew status unknown.
Check the logs.
Cole slid into the comms chair, typing quickly. His face paled.
Last entry was 19 hours ago, then nothing.
Then, from somewhere deep inside the sub, a metallic clang echoed through the hull. The team spun towards the sound, weapons raised.
Control room secure, but we're not alone down here. Moving forward.
The hum began again, a low, bone-deep vibration that seemed to come from the walls themselves. And then, the screaming started. Chapter 3, The Survivor. A man, disheveled, wide-eyed, rocking back and forth in a chair. His uniform bore the insignia of the ship's chef, James Warren.
Mate, are you all right?
Warren didn't respond. His lips moved silently, forming words that never fully came out.
James, what happened here?
The chef's eyes flicked to Carter, pupils blown wide. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he muttered,
They let me go so I could tell you.
His fingers clenched against the table, and then, as if a switch flipped, his body went rigid, and the lights flickered out completely. Chapter 4, The Dead Frequency. The world plunged into absolute darkness. Carter's breathing quickened as the lights cut out, leaving only the dim glow of emergency indicators flickering along the edges of the corridor. The low hum that had been vibrating through the submarine ceased abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. And then, a new sound. A whisper, faint, guttural, somewhere deep within the ship's structure.
Carter!
Stokes's voice crackled over the radio, breaking the momentary paralysis.
We found a survivor. He's in shock, nonverbal, and we're experiencing power failures.
Understood. We're detecting minor fluctuations in the Deterrence's reactor output from Vigilant. Be advised, the sub may not be structurally stable. Carter turned back to Warren, the ship's chef. The man's eyes were glazed, but he was still whispering something under his breath. His fingers tapped in a rhythmic pattern on the steel table, his breath coming in shallow gasps.
What's he saying?
Carter leaned in, trying to make out the soft, breathless words.
We heard it, they let me go, but it's still inside.
A cold prickle crawled up Carter's spine. Still inside? Inside what? The ship? Him?
Shit, we need to get him off this boat.
Before Carter could answer, the radio shrieked, a high-pitched, warbling burst of static, like a signal being jammed. Then the ship's intercom crackled to life.
You are listening.
The voice stretched and warped, like a recording played too slow. Then it shifted into a gut-wrenching scream, a mix of static and something profoundly wrong. The lights flickered back on, buzzing overhead. The team froze, weapons raised, scanning the shadows.
Carter, get out of there now.
The air suddenly felt thick, pressing down on them, and Carter had the distinct sensation that something unseen was in the room with them, watching. Warren stopped tapping, his eyes locked onto Carter's. And then, in the clearest voice yet, he whispered,
It knows you're here.
Chapter 5, Ghost Signals. The submarine felt alive. Not in the mechanical, humming way a nuclear-powered vessel should, but something deeper. A watchful presence. Something that had slithered into the circuits, into the steel. Carter barely had time to process Warren's whispered warning before his radio crackled violently, not static this time, but a voice. You left us behind. A deep, warbling groan echoed through the ship. The sound wasn't metal creaking, nor the usual shifting of pressure in a submarine's hull. It was something else, something inhuman.
We need to move, Carter said, keeping his voice steady. Now, where to?
Carter looked back at Warren. The chef had stopped muttering. He simply stared ahead, lips barely moving. It's in the signal. A pulse of static rippled through the floor, making the deck vibrate beneath them. Carter grabbed the nearest bulkhead for balance.
Boss, what the fuck is this?
Carter's mind raced. Something had infected the submarine. Not in a biological sense. This wasn't radiation sickness, nor some environmental hazard. No, this was inside the systems, in the comms, the electrical conduits. Something was using the ship itself. Carter keyed his radio.
Stokes, do you read?
Silence. Then a response, but not from Stokes. It's too late. They're already listening. Carter's blood ran cold. The voice was Captain Green's. Cole backed up a step, eyes darting toward the corridor.
Sir, Green's dead, he has to be.
The voice repeated, warping, stretching, as if something was playing back old transmissions. Too late. Already listening, listening. The last word echoed unnaturally, bouncing from every speaker. Carter took a steadying breath.
We get to the reactor room. We shut down whatever the hell this is before it spreads.
And him?
Warren turned his head, finally meeting Carter's gaze. His eyes were bloodshot, pupils wide. Then, in a perfect mimicry of Captain Green's voice, he said, "We are already inside." The ship's lights exploded in a shower of sparks, and then, from deep within HMS Deterrence, the alarms began to wail. Chapter 6, The Failsafe. The alarms screamed through the corridors, a wailing cacophony of distorted sirens mixed with the faint echo of voices, not from the ship's crew, but something else. Something not human. Carter's instincts screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go except deeper into HMS Deterrence. He grabbed Warren by the shoulder.
Move.
The chef didn't resist. His eyes were empty, his body obedient, but his mind somewhere else. Carter and Cole half dragged him forward, weapons raised as they navigated through the flickering hallways toward the reactor room.
Boss, Cole panted, gripping his rifle tight. We need to call this in.
I tried. Comms are compromised.
Cole didn't argue. They both knew something had infiltrated the ship's systems, and if it was in the comms, NATO wasn't hearing a damn thing. The alarms suddenly cut off, plunging the submarine into an eerie, suffocating silence. Carter didn't stop moving. He could feel it now, the wrongness of the ship. The walls felt tighter, as if the submarine was shrinking around them. Then, a sound. A whisper, soft and unmistakable, coming from the overhead speaker. Carter.
Fuck this.
Carter ignored it and kept moving. They reached the reactor room door. Locked.
Should be emergency overrides.
No need, Warren mumbled. He reached out and pressed his palm against the keypad. The door unlocked immediately. Carter grabbed his wrist.
How did you...
Warren turned his head slowly, his expression completely blank. The ship wants us inside.
Carter's stomach twisted, but he pushed forward. They stepped into the reactor control chamber. The room wasn't empty. A man stood with his back to them, motionless. His uniform was tattered, his boots soaked as if he'd been walking through water. Cole raised his rifle.
Jesus Christ.
The man turned his head slightly. Captain Green. His face was pale, his lips murmuring something too fast to understand. And the screens behind him, the reactor monitors, were flashing a single message, over and over.
External control detected. Failsafe disabled.
Carter's breath caught in his throat. Somehow, HMS Deterrence wasn't theirs anymore. Green's head tilted further, his mouth stretching into a smile too wide for his face. Then he spoke, but his voice wasn't his own.
Too late.
The reactor room plunged into darkness, and from every speaker, in every room of the submarine, the same voice whispered in unison.
We are already here.
Chapter 7, The Reactor Awakens. The darkness inside the reactor room was absolute. Carter's heartbeat thundered in his ears as his fingers tightened around his rifle. The emergency lights failed to reactivate, leaving the space bathed in a sickly dim glow from the flickering screens. The message still pulsed across the monitors.
External control detected. Failsafe disabled.
Boss, we need to get the fuck out of here.
Carter didn't disagree, but where the hell would they go? The ship was compromised, and now its captain, if that's what Green still was, stood between them and the reactor controls. Green took a slow, deliberate step forward. The floor squelched beneath his boots, as if he were wading through something not quite solid. Carter raised his rifle.
Captain, step away from the console.
Green didn't stop moving. He kept whispering, lips forming words that Carter couldn't understand, like static given language. Then the ship spoke again.
Do you hear it now?
The voice vibrated from everywhere and nowhere, as though the submarine itself was breathing. Cole's breathing hitched. The moment Carter took a step toward the reactor console, the lights flared back to life. Green was gone. The room was empty, except for them.
Boss, where the hell did he go?
Carter turned back toward the monitors. The message had changed.
HMS Deterrence reactor core foreign input detected. Protocol override. Initiating depth lock.
The submarine lurched violently downward. Carter grabbed the nearest console to keep his balance. Cole slammed against the wall. The ship was diving. Fast. Too fast. Carter grabbed the emergency comms unit and punched the direct line to HMS Vigilant.
Stokes, do you read me? The Deterrence is diving. We need an emergency extraction now.
The line crackled, then cut to static. Then Stokes' voice came through, distorted, wrong.
There is no way back.
And the reactor hummed to life. Not with the familiar, controlled energy of a nuclear system. This was something else. The walls throbbed like a pulse, a rhythmic, living beat emanating from the core. Then Carter heard it. The sound that had haunted the ship, the noise buried in the black box logs. A frequency, a deep, inhuman note that crawled inside his skull, resonating through his teeth. Warren gasped, his body convulsing. Cole fell to his knees, clutching his head. Eyes wide in agony. Carter tried to move, to resist, but the frequency held him in place. Then the ship whispered again, this time inside his head.
We are already inside you.
And with that final, sickening realization, Carter felt his mind start to slip. Chapter 8. The Point of No Return. Carter's vision blurred, his skull pounding as the frequency bored into his mind like a drill. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay conscious, but his legs felt like lead, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Through the haze, he could hear Cole screaming, clutching his ears, his rifle slipping from his grasp. Warren had collapsed completely, his body twitching, his mouth forming silent words, or maybe prayers. The reactor hummed, not with the mechanical precision of nuclear power, but with something deeper, something alive. Then, as suddenly as it started, the frequency shifted. The pressure in Carter's head eased, the walls of the submarine stopped pulsing, and the hum settled into a low rhythmic beat, like a pulse. Carter sucked in a breath and stumbled forward, grabbing Cole by the collar.
Cole, stay with me.
The fuck was that?
Carter didn't answer. He turned to Warren, shaking him.
Warren, can you move?
The chef slowly looked up. His pupils were blown wide, his face drenched in sweat. His lips parted, voice barely a whisper.
Listening.
Carter felt a chill crawl down his spine.
What's listening?
Warren's hands trembled as he lifted a shaking finger toward the reactor core. Carter followed his gaze. The reactor display had changed again. External control. Active depth lock. Engaged, 10,000 meters. Communications, terminated. Final entry uploading. Carter's stomach dropped. The Deterrence was locked into a descent. If they didn't stop it, they'd be crushed by the pressure before anyone could reach them. He keyed his radio.
HMS Vigilant, this is Carter. We're locked in a forced descent, reactors compromised, we need immediate assistance.
Silence, then a response. But it wasn't Stokes, it wasn't human.
The signal has been received. You are no longer required.
The voice was flat, emotionless, a warped mix of frequencies, as if spoken by the submarine itself. Then a new sound filled the reactor room, a groaning, metallic screech like something shifting inside the hull. Carter turned toward the doorway and froze. Captain Green was back. Standing in the corridor, his uniform torn, his skin pale, his eyes completely black. He was smiling, and he wasn't alone. Behind him, silhouettes stood in the flickering light. The missing crew, or what was left of them. Cole saw them and snapped his rifle up.
Back the fuck up.
They didn't move. Green's voice was calm, patient, almost amused.
You still think you can fight this?
He stepped forward. Cole fired. The bullet hit Green square in the chest. He didn't even flinch. The reactor pulsed again, and Carter felt the frequency return, this time deeper, more intimate, as if it was inside his very thoughts. Green tilted his head, still smiling.
You're already part of it.
Carter took a step back. His mind raced. There was one way out. They had to shut down the reactor. But as Carter looked back at the console, he realized the truth. There was no shutdown option anymore. Only one command remained: complete transfer. The reactor flared, bathing the room in a sickly, unnatural light. And then all at once, the world around them began to change. Chapter 9. The transfer begins. The reactor's glow intensified, casting the entire room in a sickly, pulsating light. The walls shuddered, and the Deterrence felt less like a submarine, and more like a living thing, a metallic organism tightening its grip on them. Carter's gaze locked onto the reactor screen. The message had changed again. Transfer initiated, 92% complete vital signs detected, integration in progress. The reactor wasn't just hijacked, it was taking them. Cole stumbled back, rifle still raised, but his hands were shaking violently.
Boss, tell me I'm hallucinating.
Carter's throat was dry.
We need to stop the transfer now.
Warren let out a sharp breath, shaking his head.
You can't stop it.
His voice was off, too calm. Carter turned sharply.
What the hell do you mean?
Warren looked up, and Carter's stomach dropped. His pupils were gone, his eyes now filled with pure blackness, just like Captain Green's.
It's already inside us.
A violent tremor rocked the submarine, sending Cole crashing into the bulkhead. Sparks spilled from the overhead panels as the Deterrence groaned like a dying beast. From the corridor, Green and the crew advanced, silent, unhurried, their twisted smiles illuminated by the flickering emergency lights. Carter ripped open a maintenance panel, exposing the reactor's emergency control relays. His mind raced. The transfer had to be running on a secondary circuit. He grabbed a tool from his vest, jamming it into the relay's manual override.
You can't stop it, Carter.
Green said softly.
You were chosen, we all were.
Carter gritted his teeth, ignoring the voice, ignoring the ship whispering in his mind. The reactor screen flickered. ANS itself began to collapse.
Move!
They sprinted through the flickering corridors, Green's screams chasing them, his voice now a warped, inhuman distortion. As they reached the airlock, Carter risked one last look back. The reactor room was engulfed in blinding light. The last thing he saw before the door slammed shut was Green dissolving, his body unraveling like strands of static, consumed by whatever force had invaded this ship. The detonation alarms blared. Carter hit the emergency launch sequence, firing their escape pod away from the Deterrence just as the submarine imploded. The last transmission to NATO command came seconds later, a voice garbled, layered with static. Not Green, not Carter, something else.
Another vessel will be found. The signal endures.
Then silence. Chapter 10. The signal endures. The escape pod tumbled violently, spinning as it shot away from the collapsing HMS Deterrence. Carter barely had time to strap himself in before the shockwave ripped through the water, sending plumes of debris and metallic wreckage spiraling past the viewport. A deep groan of destruction rumbled through the abyss as the submarine imploded upon itself, swallowed whole by the Arctic depths. It was over, or so Carter thought. The emergency beacon activated, flashing red as the pod stabilized. Depth decreasing, 9,500 meters, 8,900 sem. Cole coughed, blood trickling from his nose.
We made it?
Carter didn't answer, his pulse still hammering in his chest. He turned to check on Warren, but the moment he did, a cold chill crawled up his spine. The chef sat completely still, strapped into his seat. His lips barely moved, whispering something inaudible. Carter leaned closer.
Warren?
Warren's eyes snapped open, his pupils still blacker than the void outside. Carter recoiled, his fingers reaching for his weapon. The pod's comms panel crackled to life. Incoming transmission. Source unknown. Static filled the cabin. Then a voice.
You cannot escape.
The lights flickered, and a deep hum resonated through the pod's structure, the same frequency they had heard inside Deterrence. Cole's breathing hitched.
No, this can't be happening.
The viewport darkened as if something vast and unseen had moved in front of it, blocking out the deep-sea light. Then the whispering grew louder, not just from Warren, from the walls, from the radio, from inside their own heads. Carter clutched his skull, gritting his teeth.
Shut it off!
Cole screamed, slamming at the controls. The pod veered sharply, systems glitching as the frequency pulsed through them. Carter looked back at Warren, whose face was twisted into a grin too wide for his face.
It doesn't end here. We are the signal. We will find another vessel.
The pod systems went dark. No power, no controls, just that voice, still whispering, still listening. No voices, layered, distorted, unnatural.
The signal endures. We will find another vessel soon.
The transmission cut out, and deep beneath the Arctic ice, something waited.